My name is Sarah Davidson, the Clinical Director of the Counseling Services at the Wellness Center on campus. You are listening to the 10-Minute Tips podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to create boundaries. This topic comes up regularly in conversations with students, so I wanted to share some tips about how to be proactive and assertive in creating boundaries in relationships and with time management. First, let's define what we mean by boundaries. When we think of boundaries, many things can come to mind. We might think about borders between countries, out of bounds when playing a sport, or property lines between neighbors. For the purpose of this podcast, we'll define boundaries as simply where you end and I begin. This is not as clear as one might think. Boundaries can become especially blurry with people we are closest to or who we have a long history with. That brings up another point. Boundaries can change. As we get more comfortable with someone, we may speak less formally and become more casual in manner. Or in a romantic relationship, we may grow in our vulnerability of information shared and have physical connection, such as hand-holding, that's reserved for these types of relationships. Hopefully, these are natural and healthy progressions. It is important to have boundaries defined before entering into new relationships. The inability to set appropriate boundaries at appropriate times with the appropriate people can be very destructive. Boundaries help us distinguish what is ours so we can take care of it. So if boundaries are like a fence around our property, we need to set up initial gates so we can let out the bad or harmful when it gets inside. We also need those gates to let in the good and beneficial that it's waiting on the outside. So you know what boundaries are. So what are legitimate boundaries? Legitimate boundaries are limits and guidelines that help you take care of yourself as well as help you define your relationships with others. They really are about relationships and love, including your relationship with self. Let's start with time, because it's more clear for most of us to decide how we want to use our time. Our time usually shows our values and our needs. We'll talk about 4 ways we need to properly boundary our time. First, we all need to set aside time for meaningful work. Setting aside time to develop skills and complete tasks for your life's calling, such as school assignments, internships, and the like. For example, we have a need to earn money for life functioning, so we have some work hours representing our need. And second, we also need to establish appropriate time to spend with other people we're close to. This is time to invest in others and be invested in reciprocally. These relationships typically have a mutual benefit and are not set up to be one-sided. It could be online games, a set weekly date time, meals together, or totally spontaneous as opportunities arise. Third, we also need to establish time for physical care, such as hygiene, sleep, nutrition, and exercise. Many studies show that when we get enough sleep, are eating well, and working out, our outlook on life and our personal productivity is improved. And finally, we need to set aside the spiritual time. Set aside daily time for prayer, reading devotional material, regular church attendance, and involvement in charity bind us to a broader community, connect us with Christ in a unique way, and bring spiritual fulfillment through serving others. This is a precious commodity for most of us, so it's important to spread it around in a meaningful way. Next, let's talk about boundaries with words. Many a funny sitcom has been created out of sarcasm, puns at someone else's expense, or some other put-down. Words is another area that can be used for good or harm. Words, when used well, reflect beauty, dignity of others, create unity, connectedness, clarity, and understanding. There was a childhood recess adage, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." That never rang true for me, even as a child. I'm sure I'm not alone. Words are powerful. Research has shown the power words can have on us, both positive and negative. There are many benefits to using well thought out words that represent the best in you. Think of 2 or 3 people you feel really good being around. Describe a few examples of words they use that make you laugh, create connection, join, and comfort you. Think of some words you've been intentional about recently, maybe on social media, a note to a friend, or something you've been writing about. Are your words good, kind, true? Do they bring connection? Work really hard to create a boundary regarding your words. Finally, let's talk about physical boundaries. Not to be awkward, but it's so important when beginning romantic relationships to discuss your physical boundaries ahead of time and before someone unknowingly violates them. It can be uncomfortable if you have differing boundaries, but it's also an opportunity to show respect to yourself and to one another. This is an area you need to give yourself permission to walk away from relationships if needed. If someone cannot respect your comfort, they're more focused on their own gain, which is an imbalance of power, not a healthy start to a relationship. Be bold, be courageous when it comes to your boundaries. Now that we've talked about the definition of boundaries and some legitimate boundaries, let's talk about some of the obstacles to establishing boundaries. Because boundaries deal with where you end and I begin, we can often worry that effective boundaries will become barriers and obstacles to effective relationships. Some will ask the question, can I set limits and be a loving person? The short answer is yes. An experience I witnessed in the grocery store a few weeks ago demonstrates love and boundaries well. While out and about, I saw a mother holding a toddler boy. He wanted something, and the mother said no. In frustration, the toddler slapped her face. Her response was beautiful. She gently, but quickly, grabbed his hand, and while looking him square in the face, eye to eye, said, "No, I don't like that." He looked stunned, displeased, maybe embarrassed, but immediately put his head under her chin and gave her a hug with a few tears running down his face. She let go of his hand and hugged him back. This woman stood up for her physical, emotional, relational boundaries while still being loving and guiding her child toward appropriate behavior. She kept her dignity in place as well as his, which is loving. Others may worry, what if someone is upset or hurt by my boundaries? There are many reasons others do not like the boundaries we set. Boundaries might feel like you're pulling back from relationships and maybe even ending a relationship. It's important to have clear and direct conversations with people you care about as you head towards a change. Sometimes it is an adjustment for them and us. For example, if we're deciding to improve our grades and need more time to do homework versus hang out. Some of your relationships will change and adapt to your new boundaries, becoming even more healthy. Other relationships may have to come to an end as a result of your new boundaries. These are uncomfortable experiences, but have a high reward over time. I had an experience in high school, again right out of college, and again in my professional career, in which a friend started being really negative towards those around us. Each time, the person even went as far to gossip to me about someone I cared about deeply. I had to end the friendship because they were not interested in changing and felt justified in their behaviors. It was painful to let the person go, but over time, I let some really positive people fill the friendship gap and have enjoyed 15 years of new healthy relationships. Make sure when you're thinking about setting boundaries with others, you're thinking about what is best, what is healthy, what has positive net gains over time. Another question that comes up with boundaries is, why do I feel guilty or afraid when I consider setting boundaries? One of the major obstacles to setting boundaries is our feeling of obligation. What do we owe our parents, friends, and anyone else who has been loving towards us? Sometimes out of avoidance of setting a boundary or a sense of obligation, we do not move on from unhealthy situations, such as unhealthy relationships, a workplace, etc. We're often afraid of the consequences of making boundaries and can be avoidant of what we know needs to be done or said. Sometimes the opposite is true, and instead of setting a boundary in a relationship or workplace, we decide to move on instead of speak our limits, even though the situation would have been resolved if we directly communicated our needs. This can come up quite a bit at work. Opportunities to advance in our jobs, come across as a part of the team, or simply a desire to help another coworker out can build up over time, consistently cross our boundaries, and eventually lead to burnout. Instead, what if our inability to say no might be depriving someone else of needed shifts, opportunities for growth, leadership, or advancement, while also causing us harm? Learn to live in love and freedom and proper responsibility, not in guilt. This takes time and practice. As we draw our discussion to an end, we need to talk about ways in which poor boundaries can lead to our exploitation. I'm thinking about codependent relationships in which two people do not feel whole without the other, or in unhealthy power and control relationships in which one person has all the power. This power could be overt or come out in passive-aggressive ways, such as a victim syndrome. This might sound like, well, if you aren't going to come over now, when I need you most, then consider our friendship over. I knew you wouldn't be there for me. After all I've done for you, imagine them pointing their finger out at you, and so on. These dynamics happen in all sorts of relationships, including with peers, family, dating partners, and even close friends. This is where we need to be really intentional about adding some boundaries. Often we are in what's called a circular dynamic, and we have experienced the abrasive style of another more than once. Think about times you felt helpless for words and come up with a few responses you can feel proud about saying. These statements could be like, I don't like the way you put the blame on me when I have a reasonable explanation about why I need to delay our walk. Or, I feel really hurt when you get angry because I need to finish my work before I can hang out. Or, it doesn't feel good when you reduce our friendship to what one of us has done for the other. You get the point. Thinking before we speak. Just practice them until they sound natural. You may find you are more relaxed after practicing these responses as you add some communication tools to your tool belt. None of us like to be caught off guard or come across unkind in our relationships. As we wrap up, remember, just as homeowners set physical property lines around their land, we need to set boundaries for our lives to help us distinguish what is our responsibility and what is not. Boundaries are not so much restrictions, but opportunities for growth, respect for ourselves and others, and making sure the whole you is being tended for. If any of these initial thoughts about boundaries has started an image for you or given you some curious questions about your boundaries and what is yours to manage, take some time to write them down so you can add to it over time and really make a case for what are your boundaries and have some words to be able to communicate those to others. Creating and monitoring boundaries takes time and effort.